A simple woman walked into the most elite military camp in the country. No badge. No boots. No explanation. They laughed. But by sundown, the drones were tracking her every move. And by dawn a helicopter landed. Just for her. Have you ever seen someone so out of place, so underestimated, that it almost felt cruel? And then, watch them quietly dismantle the entire system that tried to erase them? If you're watching this, pause for a second and ask yourself, where do you usually stand when someone walks in without credentials? At the edge of curiosity or judgment. It started with a pair of shoes. Not military-issue boots, not the slick graphite models favored by special operations, not even casual sportswear brands often seen on off-duty personnel. No, just canvas sneakers. Scuffed white, slightly grayed from travel, laces tied in a practical double knot. The kind you might find in a second-hand store near a bus station. And they were stepping across the perimeter line of St. Hawthorne's Strategic Training Compound, the most decorated, hyper-secure military program in the country. A base where every pair of boots was barcoded, every rifle laser-etched with a family crest or call sign, and every face cataloged in the intake log. She had no crest, no log, no insignia, just the shoes and a white button-down tucked into khaki pants, creased from sitting. Her backpack looked surplus, not standard issue but faded, almost medical. She had dark hair tied back low and neat, no makeup, no jewelry, no stance meant to imply purpose. And yet, she walked with it. The kind of stillness that isn't a lack of motion, but the presence of something weightier, restraint, perhaps, or experience. The first cadet to notice her was leaning against a tactical transport, drinking from a hydration pouch and talking loud enough for the drone mics to catch. That delivery late? Or is she lost? He asked, not bothering to whisper. Another cadet joined in, this one with mirrored sunglasses and the kind of wristwatch that suggested inherited power. Looks like supply chain sent us a new janitor, he joked, nudging his friend. A third cadet, a woman in matte black fatigues, didn't laugh but didn't stop it either. Instead, she flicked her gaze down to the shoes and muttered, check the sneakers. No way she's cleared. The mockery traveled fast. In elite spaces like these, difference wasn't just noticeable, it was intolerable. It disrupted the visual code, the symmetry of superiority. Everyone at St. Hawthorne wore their affiliations like armor, badges, medals, bloodlines. The only unspoken rule was never blend in with the unranked. So when a woman walked through the gravel without saluting, without reporting, without so much as a clipboard, she became a threat. Not because of what she did, but because of what she didn't do. Apologize. Within 30 minutes, screenshots of her had circulated on the internal network. One cadet drew a red circle around her shoes and posted the image under a thread titled, Today's Glitch. Comments followed. Civilian breach? Lost ghost. Logistics forgot their leftovers. Even instructors noticed. Captain Riggs, sharp-lined, polished, paused his conversation mid-sentence when she passed. Excuse me, he called. Are you lost? She gave a nod, not of confusion but acknowledgement, and kept walking. Not fast. Not defiant. Just forward. There was something deeply unsettling about her silence. Not frightened. Not proud. Just watching. Observing the drills, the fire team rotations, the comms check-ins. Her eyes scanned the grounds not like someone unfamiliar, but like someone returning. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. When a cadet deliberately tossed an empty sports bottle that rolled to her feet, she picked it up and dropped it in the bin without a word. And still she remained. By midday, jokes had turned to strategy. Cadets began testing her, dropping insults just loud enough for her to hear. She's probably someone's girlfriend who doesn't know the rules, one offered. Maybe a psych test? Like bait? Another guessed. The mystery irritated them. Cadets lived for clarity, briefings, ranks, protocols. She offered none. At 1:17 p.m., Lieutenant Voss confronted her near the digital supply board. Clipboard clutched tight, tone clipped. You're not listed on the manifest, she said. Emma didn't respond. She simply stepped aside. Voss wrote a note anyway, not because it mattered, but because someone had to assert the structure. Inside the compound's command trailer, her presence had already triggered keyword alerts. One operator flagged her movement pattern, straight lines, even pace, consistent observation. Another tagged her footage. Unidentified, non-uniformed presence. No hostile behavior. No comms breach. Track but do not engage. The camp wasn't panicking. It was scrutinizing. Because in this place, everything was monitored. And yet, no one could figure out how she'd gotten in. At 2:40 p.m., a squad leader named Ben Trace decided to make it personal. He walked past her at the hydration station, uncapped a half-full bottle of water, and under the guise of cooling off, tilted it just enough for the water to stream down onto the toes of her shoes. It soaked into the canvas. A cadet nearby whispered, "Oops. Watering the weeds." They laughed. She didn't. She looked down, then shifted her weight slightly, like the chill had just reached her socks. And she kept standing there. That was the shift. That was the moment it stopped being funny. Not because she yelled, or pushed back, or demanded anything, but because she didn't move. Because by now, everyone wanted her to. They needed her to flinch, to retreat, to reveal that she wasn't supposed to be there. But she never gave them that. By 3:30 p.m., the mood had turned. Not loud. Not angry. Just unsettled. A cadet muttered, "She thinks she's untouchable." Another added, "Maybe she forged credentials." The instructors, too, began whispering. No one could find her name in any intake list. A junior analyst checked the security logs. Nothing. She simply appeared. And still, she did not leave. She watched as squads ran tactical recon. She stood still as others jogged past her. And the strange thing? No one could remember exactly where she came from. It was as if she'd always been there. Or worse, as if she knew where she was going the entire time. At 4:42, a final internal note pinged through the command loop. It read, "Unknown civilian has not exited grounds. Surveillance active. No action required." But here's the thing no one realized yet. Emma wasn't lost. She wasn't testing them. She wasn't confused. She was watching. Waiting. Not for permission. But for necessity. And within 18 hours, she'd get it. Because the entire simulation they had spent weeks preparing for would collapse. Command would lose control. Teams would scatter, signals would drop, and no one would know what to do. Except her. But that's not this chapter. This chapter is about how the most elite training program in the country failed the most basic test of all. Recognition. Because sometimes leadership doesn't walk in with polished boots. Sometimes it steps across gravel in canvas shoes and just waits for you to pay attention. So tell me, when someone like Emma walks into your field of vision, do you notice? Or do you look away because they don't look like they belong? Because what you do next might be the only test that matters. The morning after Emma's quiet arrival at St. Hawthorne felt no different to most. The compound buzzed with the static energy of routine. Drones slicing through the dawn air, cadets forming up in staggered rows, instructors barking orders with the certainty of habit. But beneath the polished surface, a thread had already frayed. It wasn't visible to the untrained eye, but it pulsed through the halls, traveled between glances, and took root in every clipped sentence whispered just out of earshot. No one had expected her to still be there. Yet there she was, standing at the far edge of the quad beside the admin platform, arms lightly crossed, her backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder like she wasn't in the heart of a hypersecure facility. She hadn't moved much during the night. Security logs noted her presence through thermal scans, but no breach, no trespass. She had simply occupied space, and that, in itself, had become a problem. This was a camp built on order, on layers of hierarchy so refined they bled into posture, into tone, into how long someone was allowed to hold eye contact. Everyone had a number, a name tag, a briefing packet. Emma had none of these. And still she stood. At 0600 hours sharp, the first trial began. Dubbed Operation Hollow Path, it was a simulation built to stretch every squad past their comfort zone. Recon, construction of a forward base, defense protocols, hostage recovery. 10 teams. 40 hours. Real terrain. Real risks. No resets. From the command tent, instructors watched as encrypted tablets were distributed to squad leaders. Tactical routes loaded, topographical errors included by design. Fire teams moved like precision clockwork, on paper at least. But the human factor is never on paper. And human eyes kept drifting back to the woman in canvas shoes. Emma watched from behind the barrier, not interfering, not intruding, simply present. It should have been benign. But it wasn't. Every cadet that passed her felt something gnawing at the edges of certainty. She hasn't been cleared, one muttered while adjusting his chest rig. Then why is she still here? Another responded. No one had an answer. That silence began to fracture the invisible grid of discipline that held the compound together. It began small. A misread terrain signal. Team 4 moved too far east and dropped out of satellite coverage. Their comms blinked into static. The control room hesitated. Were they repositioning? Testing alternative routes? Protocol dictated a 15-minute window before intervention. So they waited. But then Team 2 deployed a fire team without backup, and the perimeter folded within 30 minutes. Voices rose inside the command center. Too many radios crackling at once, too many hands reaching for solutions that weren't there. A junior officer attempted to triangulate a missing beacon and failed. Another began pulling archived terrain overlays, but couldn't decrypt fast enough. Emma didn't move, but her eyes never left the central command screen. She stood slightly behind the operations tent, close enough to see, just far enough to remain peripheral. And then Team 7, relying on a mislabeled grid reference, built their base camp in a dry riverbed designed to simulate IED terrain. They didn't know they were boxed in. By the time the field director realized, 3 squads were out of position, and one was no longer responding at all. A cadet burst into the trailer, breathless. "We've lost them," he said, voice too high-pitched to be professional. "No one's answering beacon calls. Command post is just dead." Instructors traded glances. Panic didn't show on their faces, but it clung to the air like sweat. Someone issued an order to pause the simulation, but it was too late. The failure had momentum now. The system built to monitor and correct itself was gridlocked by its own perfectionism. That was when she moved. Emma stepped toward the open side of the trailer and picked up the spare comms unit resting on the side table. She didn't ask, didn't clear her throat. She just lifted the device to her mouth. "This is Ward," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't strain. It didn't demand. It instructed. Team 2, fall back 20 meters from the northern tree line. Re-establish a defensive spread. Elevate your signal beacon. Confirm when vertical range is reached. A flicker on the monitor. Then a line of static turned green. "Confirmed," came the reply. No one moved. She kept going. "Team 4, you're exposed. Move east by grid 2. Avoid the ravine. Regroup at Delta 47 high ground. Confirm when secure." Green. Again. The lead instructor stepped back instinctively, not because of protocol, but because he understood what he was witnessing. Emma traced a path across the map with her finger. "Team 7, abandon the perimeter. Send recon to Point Echo. Redirect medevac to Rally 3. Her voice created order where training had failed. Not because she was louder, but because she saw what they didn't. And still no one asked who she was. They just listened. Every cadet, every staff member in the command trailer, every set of eyes glued to the feed, recognized something ancient. Authority not given, but earned. She didn't fumble. She didn't theorize. She led. "Turn off tracking pulses," she said. "Stagger squad positions. Hold until beacon confirms." Confirmed. For the next 47 minutes, the simulation transformed. The chaos that had splintered across sectors began folding into cohesion. Team stabilized. A lost unit was located. All objectives were recovered. And at 52 minutes and 46 seconds, the trial ended. No casualties. No resets. The drone feed hovered over the training field. Cadets pulled off helmets, stared up at the sky, unsure what had just happened. Inside the command trailer, one word sat on everyone's tongue, but no one said it. "Who is she?" Then came the search. A name. A record. And with it, shock. Tactical commendations. Jungle warfare. Honorably discharged 5 years prior. Her last listed role, Major. But by then, the helicopters were already inbound. She had led them back from the edge, and hadn't even stepped inside the map room. She hadn't been a ghost. She had just been waiting for the right moment. To act. To be seen. To remind them all that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who says nothing. And now they knew. The silence that followed the end of the simulation was unlike anything St. Hawthorne had experienced before. Not the ceremonial silence of a completed drill, not the procedural pause before debrief, but a stunned, suspended stillness, as if every individual in the compound had been collectively unplugged from their egos and made to face something more honest than protocol. Emma Ward stood near the rear corner of the command trailer, her hands loosely folded behind her back, her eyes on the ground, not in shame or exhaustion, but in composure. She didn't look up when a junior instructor began stammering into a headset, trying to explain how the drill had turned around so rapidly. She didn't react when 2 cadets whispered her name like it was a password they had never been taught. For almost a minute, the only sound in the command tent came from the gentle hum of the drones overhead and the occasional beep of status confirmations flashing green across the simulation interface. Then a voice cut through the air. Colonel Arlen, weathered from 40 years of hardened command, straightened his posture and asked the question everyone had been circling without the courage to say aloud. "Who trained you?" he asked, his voice low but penetrating. Emma met his eyes for the first time. "Joint Recon. Eastern Division," she replied, her tone free of embellishment. A few heads turned. Even those who had heard of that division had rarely met anyone from it. It was the kind of assignment whispered about in late-night strategy sessions and footnotes on highly classified documents. She continued after a pause. "I stepped away 5 years ago." She didn't say why. She didn't have to. The weight of what she had just done rendered the details irrelevant. One of the cadets watching from the flap of the tent instinctively lowered his phone, as if the act of recording her presence now felt inappropriate. Another adjusted his collar. And then the drone camera shifted, zooming out, capturing the broader scene as dust lifted slightly from the ground outside, stirred by the low approach of incoming rotors. It wasn't a routine flight. Everyone knew it. No training chopper flew that low over the compound during lockdown drills. No aircraft without immediate clearance used the primary pad. But this one did. Matte black. Unmarked, except for a discrete crest belonging to Strategic Joint Command. The sound grew louder, more rhythmic, pulsing like a warning. And then it landed. General Nathan Cross stepped out first, his movements unhurried but precise. His uniform was field standard but pressed, collar insignia gleaming with the cluster stars of supreme operations. He crossed the pad without a word, aides flanking him at a respectful distance, but none dared enter the tent with him. When he stepped inside, the air changed. The instructors shifted. The cadets holding post near the entry stood taller without realizing it. The general looked only at her. No address to the room. No demand for explanation. He stood before Emma Ward and raised his hand in a deliberate, formal salute. "Major Ward," he said, voice clear and carrying. "You haven't lost your edge." She nodded once. Just once. The general turned to face the room. "This camp failed today," he said, not with anger, but with the kind of surgical disappointment that cuts deeper than volume. Not because of its operation, but because of what preceded it. A woman with more combat hours than most of your instructors walked this ground for 2 days, and was mocked, ignored, ridiculed. And when the mission fell apart, she didn't say, "I told you so." She picked up a radio and saved it. You could feel the oxygen pull from the tent. Eyes shifted to the floor, to walls, to anything except the woman standing perfectly still in shoes still bearing the faint mark of spilled water. General Cross continued, "Major Ward has more operational clearance in her little finger than half of you have on your intake files. She doesn't need a badge to be obeyed. She doesn't need a podium to lead. She earned the right to command through action. You failed to see it. She didn't need your permission to step forward, but you gave her no choice." No one moved. Behind him, the main screen still displayed her last field order in glowing green. Status, record operation. 0 failures. General Cross turned back to her. "Your record is intact. Your legacy is intact. If you want reinstatement, it's yours." Emma didn't answer. Instead, she turned slightly, looking beyond him to the cadets outside the tent. They were gathered loosely in formation, quiet now, their usual bravado absent. Some still had dirt smeared across their faces from the trial, helmets held underarm, expressions unreadable. She stepped forward. "I didn't come here to lead," she said. "I came to observe. But when the moment required it, I acted. That's the lesson." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, of recalibration, of something breaking and something better being built. A shift that could not be undone. Colonel Arlen cleared his throat, subdued. "We'll initiate a full review," he said, eyes not meeting hers. General Cross nodded. "Do that." As the drone circled overhead once more, Emma stepped out of the tent and walked across the lot. This time, cadets moved aside without being asked. Not in fear, not in reverence, but in recognition. Like gravity had shifted, and they were adjusting their course to meet it. Inside the camp's digital systems, new logs were generated. A list. Every instance of documented harassment over the past 48 hours. Every ignored tag, every internal message, every joke made at her expense. For cadets were quietly removed from trial eligibility. No announcement. Their names simply vanished from the operations roster. The system did not blink. 2 instructors, Captain Riggs and Lieutenant Voss, were reassigned to off-site duty. Their credentials revoked, their names omitted from future rotations. Staff who had laughed or said nothing were quietly noted in internal reports. Not blacklisted, but known, documented. An ethics case study was uploaded to the Central Archive, listed as required viewing for future cycles. Case Study 47, Bias and Operational Oversight. It opened with footage of Emma Ward standing beside a trash can, holding an empty bottle that had been rolled toward her like an insult. That image would become the first lesson every new cadet encountered from that day forward. But Emma? She said nothing through it all. She stayed at the edge of the field, her backpack still slung low, shoes still dusted. The mark from the water had almost faded, but no one who'd seen it would forget it. Director Rohr approached her mid-afternoon, stopped a full pace away. "Major," he said quietly, "I failed to extend you proper protocol. I regret that." Emma looked at him, offered a single nod. She didn't smile. She didn't offer absolution, and he didn't ask for it. At 1,700 hours, a new module was added to the training curriculum. Leadership without insignia. Instructor, guest E. Ward. 1 session. Optional. But the sign-up filled in under an hour. No headline followed. No press release. Just a shift. Quiet. Absolute. The kind only truth can cause. And at its center stood a woman who never asked to be seen. Who never raised her voice to be respected. Who simply waited. Then spoke. Once. And rewrote the room. By the time the sun began its descent behind the ridgeline bordering St. Hawthorne, the compound had returned to motion, but not to normal. The energy that had once filled the space with competition, pride, and predictable hierarchy had turned inward. Cadets moved with quieter steps, instructors gave fewer orders, and no one questioned why a woman with no uniform, no insignia, and no assigned quarters was still there. They all knew, and knowing had changed them. Emma Ward did not retreat into solitude. She remained present, but peripheral, still choosing to stay at the edges of command structures rather than at the center of them. She did not accept reinstatement, did not demand acknowledgement, did not seek out praise. She declined overnight accommodations, choosing instead to sit alone on a bench near the observation ridge, a simple spot overlooking the terrain she had corrected just hours earlier. The bench had no plaque, no name. Like her. And like her, it held steady. Colonel Arlen passed her once as the last wave of drills ended, pausing just a moment to offer a quiet observation. "We've never had a field op end that cleanly." She said nothing in return. He didn't expect her to. He nodded and left her there, silhouetted by the softening sky, a figure more remembered than spoken of. That night, inside the admin facility, the final review logs were compiled. Footage was selected, 3 primary clips, each carefully time-stamped. The first showed Emma standing beside the trash bin, the water stain visible on her shoe. The second captured the moment she stepped toward the comms unit during the simulation collapse. And the third, her final order, the drone footage cutting across the terrain like an orchestrated ballet, teams moving with unspoken precision. That footage would become mandatory viewing for all future operational training cycles. There were no names attached to the clips. No overlays. No narration. Just raw video, offered without commentary, because what had happened didn't need explanation. It needed memory. What no one said, what no official line in the logs recorded, was the subtle transformation already taking place among the cadets. During mess hall check-ins, voices lowered. Instructors who once assigned drill partners based solely on rank began rebalancing roles based on performance under pressure. And in unrecorded conversations behind barracks walls, cadets began repeating her name, not as a punchline, but as a reference point. A new metric for credibility. By morning, a new behavior had taken hold. When someone entered a room and another was already seated alone, they paused before speaking. They looked. They considered. No one called it policy, but it was followed all the same. At 0800 the next day, Emma arrived at the lecture hall for her guest session. The door was already open. The cadets were already inside, early, not because they were told to be, but because none wanted to miss the one session now whispered about across the compound. The course was titled Leadership Under Pressure. One session. Optional. Yet every seat was filled. A few instructors stood quietly along the back wall. Emma entered without ceremony. Her clothes were unchanged, same white button-down, faintly creased. Same khaki pants, dust along the seams. The same canvas backpack rested beside her chair. A small guest badge clipped to her pocket, laminated but temporary. No one mistook her for temporary. She said little as she prepared the projection. No greetings. No grand opening. She simply stood at the screen and projected a map, clean, stripped of excess data. It was the same map used in the simulation, but rendered now in quiet clarity. She pointed to a section near the ravine. "This is where Team 4 misread their elevation marker," she said. Her voice was measured even. "Tell me why." A cadet raised his hand. The terrain looked flatter on the thermal overlay. She nodded. "And what should they have done instead?" Another cadet spoke up. "Re-verify with the analog compass cross-check." Emma nodded again. There was no scolding, no tone of failure. She moved to the next sequence. "This," she said, "is where Team 2 overextended without coverage. What do you notice?" No one answered immediately. She let the silence breathe. Then a hand lifted. The gap in response range was already visible, if you knew what to look for. She said nothing. Just let that hang in the air until they all understood. What they had missed had never been hidden. It had simply been ignored. She clicked to the next image. This time a drone feed overhead. Cadets passed across the lot in every direction. Emma's figure was visible at the center, unnoticed. "This," she said, "is what it looks like when a leader isn't recognized." No one spoke. No one needed to. They weren't taking notes. They were just listening. When she closed the projection, she did so without summary. She lifted her backpack, slung it over her shoulder. Then she paused. "Carry it forward," she said. That was all. They stood as she left, not because it was required, but because something inside them had shifted toward respect. That night, the training manual was updated. A new paragraph was added under the leadership protocol section. It read, "All personnel are to be evaluated by behavior under pressure. Uniforms, titles, and affiliations may not substitute for direct observation and situational conduct." It was signed off by Colonel Arlen, but the suggestion had come from Emma. Her name was not listed. Days passed. Then a week. Emma remained on base, not as part of any roster, but as a presence, quiet, constant, untethered to obligation. She turned down a permanent advisory role. Declined reinstatement, even when it came with honors and full clearance. When she was asked what she wanted, she said, "A ticket to the next outbound rail junction." No escort. No debrief. Just distance. When the day came, she carried nothing but her backpack. At the security gate, a cadet paused before opening the barrier. He didn't speak immediately. Then finally he said, "You changed everything." She looked at him, not unkindly but with calm. "No," she replied. "I just reminded you to pay attention." He nodded. "Open the gate." She stepped through. And that was that. No farewell. No salute. But back inside the compound, a quiet custom remained. When someone gave orders in a quiet tone, they listened the first time. When someone without credentials crossed their path, they hesitated before judging. And when someone walked the gravel field with nothing but presence, they remembered. Because of her, Emma Ward boarded the train without fanfare, sat by the window, opened a small notepad, wrote nothing. She didn't need to. The lesson had already landed. And this time it would stay. The train hummed softly beneath her feet, the rhythm steady, familiar in its detachment. Emma Ward sat by the window, hands resting quietly in her lap, the same canvas backpack placed beside her on the seat like it had been since the day she entered the compound. She hadn't spoken since boarding. She didn't need to. The scenery outside passed in gentle blurs, forests giving way to plains, dirt roads unraveling across nameless stretches of land, but Emma's focus wasn't outward. It rarely was. She sat still, not lost in thought, but anchored in something deeper. Awareness without urgency, memory without attachment. She had left behind no message, no expectation. And yet, behind her, a shift unfolded at St. Hawthorne with the weight of a turning tide. Within days of her departure, cadet formations adjusted. Not from new policy but instinct. They paused when someone unfamiliar entered a drill space. They listened more closely to soft-spoken instructors. They reviewed footage with renewed humility, seeing not just failure or success, but the blind spots in between. Among the instructors, something subtler occurred. Lesson plans were rewritten, not because orders had changed, but because the assumptions beneath them had. Captain Riggs' replacement arrived 2 days after Emma's exit. His opening brief included a line that hadn't appeared in training doctrine before: "Never confuse silence for insignificance." The cadets didn't react outwardly, but several exchanged quick glances. They knew exactly where that line had come from. Meanwhile, within the Joint Command Network, a memo circulated quietly, flagged for internal review only. Subject line: Operational Leadership Reassessment Protocol, Ward Incident. It wasn't written as an accusation, nor did it name specific failings. Instead, it posed a single, cutting question: what systems failed to identify leadership before the moment of crisis? The document included clips, select segments from the simulation, annotated without commentary. In one, Emma's voice layered over chaos, restoring command in under a minute. In another, she walked past a group of cadets laughing at her shoes. And in the final frame, she stood by a bin, holding a bottle someone else had thrown toward her path, placing it gently in the trash without looking around. At first, the footage was assigned only to oversight teams. Then, without formal directive, it began appearing in briefing rooms across regional facilities. From Eastern Division to Arctic Recon, officers watched the same sequence, each one left with the same uneasy silence. Not because of what was said, but because of what hadn't been. The truth had never been buried, just overlooked. At the edge of the command training facility, a statue had been in quiet proposal for years, an installation meant to commemorate the founding officers of the simulation program. The project had been stalled repeatedly over disagreements in design and scope. 3 weeks after Emma's departure, the proposal resurfaced. But this time, the inscription was changed. No names, no dates, just a bronze depiction of a pair of worn canvas shoes, resting at the edge of a gravel path. Beneath it, a plaque read: "Respect isn't always visible, but it is always earned." When the model was approved, no one mentioned her by name. They didn't have to. She had become a story, a code word passed among those who understood the meaning of unseen strength. Instructors began incorporating her choices into situational drills. What do you do when a silent observer enters your command space? Do you check credentials, or do you ask who they are? Do you test them, or listen? These weren't hypotheticals anymore. They were doctrine. And still, Emma said nothing. She moved from the rail station to a small transit town, checked into a local residence under her own name. No aliases. No coded re-entry into classified channels. She spent her mornings walking the perimeter of a quiet park on the town's edge. She read. She wrote nothing. She offered no interviews, declined requests for comment. Once, a man in uniform approached her while she sat alone beneath a tree. He was mid-ranking, not local. Likely sent by someone who wanted her perspective on a new task force initiative. He introduced himself, fumbled over his words, and finally asked if she would be willing to return to advise. She looked at him, calm and kind, and replied, "That's not why I did it." He nodded, uncertain of what he had hoped for. He thanked her anyway and left. But the change continued without her. A training module she had unknowingly inspired, leadership without insignia, became the most requested elective at St. Hawthorne's next intake cycle. Cadets didn't attend for credit. They attended to understand, to witness what it meant to lead without volume, without expectation, without waiting for permission. One of the final slides in that course featured no text, no bullet points. Just a still image from drone footage. Emma walking through the compound, cadets facing the other way. The instructor let the silence linger before advancing to the next slide. Far away from the echo of drills and simulation towers, Emma continued walking her small paths. She bought fruit from local vendors, nodded politely to neighbors she never asked names of. At night, she sat by a single window that overlooked a narrow road, watching as occasional headlights drew slow arcs across her wall. Once, in a nearby library, she found a newspaper folded between the shelves. The headline read, "Combat Training Academy Revamps Ethics Framework After Unnamed Incident." She read it twice, then gently refolded the paper and returned it to its place. She didn't take it with her. Weeks later, a package arrived at the academy. No return address. Inside was a single note, handwritten and signed. It read, "It's not about whether someone is qualified to lead. It's about whether you're paying attention when they already are." Alongside it was a pair of worn canvas sneakers, neatly cleaned, laces tied, soles still marked by use. They were placed in a display case near the ethics wing. No sign indicated who had sent them. No one asked. They just stood there, quiet and complete. And when new cadets asked why they were displayed without explanation, older ones would reply with a sentence that had no origin but had already become tradition. Because leadership doesn't walk in with a salute. Sometimes it walks in quietly and waits for you to notice. Emma Ward's name faded from daily records, not from erasure, but because it no longer needed to be said aloud to be remembered. She didn't disappear. She became something quieter. A standard. A reflection. The unspoken checkpoint each person now carried within themselves. When you see someone overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, what do you do next? That had become the real test. And no one wanted to fail it again. On a cool morning in late autumn, Emma stood at the edge of a wooded trail, the sound of birds barely audible over the wind. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathed deep, then turned and walked forward, not toward any mission, not into any command, but simply onward. Her steps were measured light, still unhurried, still unannounced. And somewhere far behind her, a generation was still listening.